Hey friends, before we even get into today's episode, I need you to stay with me because what you're about to hear isn't just another reality TV disagreement. This is a moment where decades of silence, family history, and buried truth collide. One conversation, one man, and one belief system that shaped generations is finally being challenged. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this discussion is making people so uncomfortable and why once you see it, you can't unsee it. So don't skip this one because everything changes from here. Hey friends, welcome back. Today, because what unfolds in this episode is not just another family discussion, it is a moment that pulls the curtain back on a belief system that has shaped lives, controlled choices, and left scars that many people are still trying to understand. And at the center of this moment stands David, Christine Brown's husband, a man whose words are already causing tension before the conversation even truly begins. Because David does not speak from theory or distant observation. He speaks from lived experience, from family history, and from loss that never really fades. David is openly against polygamy. He does not believe it should be defended, normalized, or protected, and he does not soften his stance to make it easier for others to hear. What he says is direct, uncomfortable, and deeply personal, because long before he ever entered this family, polygamy had already touched his life in ways that would permanently shape how he sees the world. His two older sisters married into a polygamous family in Mexico. Both women entered that life believing the promises they were taught, believing that sacrifice would bring stability, believing that obedience would bring peace. But over time, what they experienced was not harmony. It was pressure, isolation, and emotional harm. And eventually, both women left that world. But leaving did not erase what they went through. And David grew up watching the aftermath, watching the long-term effects on women who had been told their suffering had meaning, that their silence was required, and that their worth was measured by how much they could endure. Those experiences stayed with him, and they became the foundation of his beliefs, not because he wanted to judge others, but because he saw firsthand what the system allowed and encouraged. His sisters married into the Langford family, a group connected to a wider network of polygamous communities based in Mexico. Communities that exist because decades ago, when the practice of plural marriage was officially abandoned by the mainstream church and outlawed in the United States, those who refused to let go felt betrayed and displaced. So they left the country entirely, searching for places where enforcement was limited and oversight minimal. Mexico became that place, not because the practice was accepted culturally, but because it was not aggressively pursued. And over time, these isolated colonies formed tight-knit, closed-off communities that operated under their own rules with little accountability. And while some of these groups remained small and quiet, others became infamous, marked by internal conflict, power struggles, and even violence. Names like the LeBaron family still echo through this history, and their story is not distant from Christine or David because these families are intertwined through generations and shared belief systems. Christine herself comes from this world. She's the granddaughter of Rulon Allred, a man whose death is still spoken about in hushed tones, a man whose murder is part of the same violent history that haunts these communities. David knows these stories, not from books, from family conversations, from survivors' voices, and from watching the emotional weight carried by those who lived through it. And the danger did not end with the past. In recent years, violence struck again when families connected to these communities were targeted in a devastating attack near La Mora. Vehicles were ambushed, lives were lost, and among the victims was David's niece, Donna Langford. Her mother, David's sister, had already left the community, but Donna had stayed behind. And that loss is something that does not fade with time. It becomes part of who you are. And that is why when David speaks about polygamy, he does not do so cautiously. He does not frame it as an abstract debate, because for him, the cost is real. The consequences are measured in trauma, separation, and death. And when he brings this perspective into the Brown family dynamic, it immediately creates friction, especially with Janelle Brown, because Janelle does not see his words as protective. She sees them as dangerous. She pushes back. She argues that harm exists in all types of relationships and that it is unfair to judge an entire lifestyle based on painful experiences. And on the surface, that response may sound reasonable. But what makes this moment so heavy is the context, because David is not attacking individuals, he is describing a structure, and structures matter because they determine who holds power and who bears risk. In a polygamous system, one man is shared by multiple women, and that reality alone creates imbalance because affection, time, and resources are limited and can be shifted at will. And when a husband holds the ability to withdraw attention or redirect it to another wife, compliance becomes a survival strategy. Punishment does not need to be loud or visible. Neglect is enough. Distance is enough. And children are inevitably affected because a mother's standing often determines her children's access to their father. And that dynamic forces women into impossible positions: stay quiet or risk everything. And this is not speculation. It is behavior that viewers have watched unfold for years within this very family. David points out that this imbalance gives men leverage, whether they acknowledge it or not, and that leverage shapes behavior, choices, and emotional safety. And this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because it challenges the idea that all relationships within polygamy are equal partnerships. David explains that beyond emotional dynamics, there is also a spiritual hierarchy, especially within fundamentalist belief systems, where the husband is positioned as the spiritual authority, the one through whom blessings flow, the one whose approval is tied to eternal outcomes. Women are taught that their spiritual future depends on their obedience to him, and that belief alone creates a profound imbalance before any relationship issue even arises. Girls raised inside this framework are taught from an early age that jealousy is a personal failure, that sharing a husband is expected, and that suffering is righteous. They are taught that if something goes wrong in their marriage, the responsibility lies with them, not with the man. And these teachings shape identity, self-worth, and silence. And when someone raised in that system defends it, they are not necessarily lying. They are often protecting the only framework they were given to survive within. And that is why David's presence is so disruptive, because he does not have nostalgia for the system. He does not feel loyalty to it, and he does not frame his words to protect it. He speaks plainly about power, control, and consequences. And that honesty forces a reckoning, not just with the past, but with beliefs that still linger. And this is only the beginning of a conversation that will test relationships, challenge long-held narratives, and expose just how differently people understand the same experience, depending on how far they have stepped away from it. What makes the next part of this conversation even more intense is that it moves beyond history and into the present, forcing everyone involved to confront not just what polygamy was, but what it still represents emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually for those who lived inside it and those who managed to step away. And this is where the divide between David and Janelle becomes impossible to ignore, because Janelle does not just disagree with his conclusions, she reacts to the implications of what he is saying. When David explains that polygamy operates through control rather than equality, Janelle responds by suggesting that abuse and tragedy exist in all forms of relationships, and that it is dangerous to generalize. And on the surface, that sounds balanced, reasonable, even fair. But the problem is that it sidesteps the core issue David is raising, which is not that harm can exist anywhere, but that some systems are designed in ways that make harm more likely, easier to hide, and harder to escape. And this distinction matters deeply, because in a system where one person holds disproportionate emotional, financial, and spiritual power, that imbalance shapes every interaction, even the ones that appear peaceful on the outside. David is not saying every man in polygamy intends to cause harm. He is saying the structure itself gives men leverage, whether they acknowledge it or not, and that leverage can be used consciously or unconsciously to control behavior, silence dissent, and enforce obedience. And we have seen exactly how that plays out over time, when affection becomes conditional, when access to resources is tied to compliance, and when emotional withdrawal becomes a tool for discipline. This is not partnership. This is hierarchy. And what makes Janelle's response so difficult to understand is that she herself lived through years of emotional neglect, financial imbalance, and shifting loyalty. She experienced what it felt like to be deprioritized, to have her needs minimized, and to watch resources she contributed be redirected elsewhere. And yet, when David names the pattern, she resists the conclusion because acknowledging it fully would require confronting not just Cody's behavior, but the belief system that justified it. And that is an incredibly painful step for anyone to take. Belief systems are not just ideas, they are identity. They shape how people understand their purpose, their worth, and their future. And dismantling them feels like losing the ground beneath your feet. And this is why secrecy plays such a powerful role in these communities, because isolation protects one argument or one opinion. It was about truth finally being spoken and the discomfort that comes with it. Some people have fully walked away, while others are still untangling what they were taught. And that gap explains everything. Once you recognize the system for what it is, the story changes forever. And that's why this conversation matters more than it seems. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.